David Kessler, such a pleasure to meet you for the first time and to interview you on cleaning up the mental mess. I know my audience is going to love you. You talk about something that people ask me about so much, but you have such a beautiful way of handling it. I mean, you are one of the foremost leaders in the world when it comes to grief, and you've written some incredible best-selling books. You have an amazing new workbook that we're going to be talking about today, and you have a great website. You have lots of videos. You've also had your own personal experiences with grief with your mom and your son, and you're just such a help to the world. And thank you for what you do, and thank you for coming on this podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you, Caroline. May I call you Caroline?
Of course, please, go ahead.
Thank you. And of course, David. So thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you and with everyone who's listening and watching today. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Yeah, grief is something that I always say we have a grief illiterate society.
I agree.
We're not taught about this. In some ways, I feel like I'm teaching people what our great-grandparents knew how to do. And it's just not passed down. As you may know, you can become a therapist in this world without ever taking one grief class. You can go through life without anyone teaching you about grief. And yet, I always say the death rate, unfortunately, is 100%.
Yep, there you go.
We're all going to deal with this. So that's, I think, my work is to try to make this a little easier and digestible. It's the hardest thing in the world. And when you know a little bit about it, it does make a really tough journey just a little easier.
You're absolutely right. And you're very compassionate. I've watched you online and things, and you're very compassionate and you've experienced it yourself. And if I may, are you comfortable just talking about your two sort of main experiences with your mom and your son? If you're not comfortable,
no,
that is fine.
For checking. That's very kind. I always say no one chooses, like no one's in third grade going, I want to be a death and grief expert. I grew up with a mother who was always in and out of hospitals. And then when I was 13, she had to go a few hours away to the big city hospital. We were at a hotel across the street. And at one point, and by the way, I couldn't visit her because you had to be 14 and I was 13. A few nurses let me sneak in once in a while. But I spent all my time in the hospital lobby and in the hotel lobby across the street. One day, someone starts in the hotel yelling fire. They evacuate us all out. And on the 18th floor, flames are coming out. Huge fire. The fire trucks are pulling up. And here's something that's a little strange, but it's not unusual in trauma. I experienced part of this as exciting because I was a bored child who was in like all these, lobbies. And all of a sudden I went from excitement, guns started shooting. They realized this isn't just a fire. This turned out to be one of the first mass shootings in the US.
Oh my gosh.
Went on for all day long, 7 hours. It was a lesson for the police department, a tragic lesson in everything not to do in mass shootings. My father eventually, and I saw people die, first responders and all this. My father eventually got us back to the hospital. And when we were back there, within a couple of days, my mother died. And
oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I was damaged for life. I thought I was ruined. And no one talked about it. There was no one there to help. The only advice that anyone gave me was be strong.
Oh gosh.
Which often means don't have feelings and take care of everyone else. And so, I just shut down. And it wasn't until I went to community college and I took this class on death and dying. I didn't know there was such a thing. And they talked about this woman, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote this book on death and dying. And little did I know I would grow up to be someone who would do 2 books with her. And in one of the books,
amazing.
I helped her adapt her amazing stages of dying for stages of grief. And literally, Caroline, on page 1 of that book, we say the stages aren't linear. There's no one right way to do grief. There's no one right model. There's no map. Here's the thing, for people, grief is so unknown. For many people, whether it's the stage model or Therese Rando's model or William Warren's model, or million models, some of them give folks structure in a world that feels like it has no structure. For others, they feel like they're being asked to follow rules, and there are no rules in grief. So I always hear Elizabeth's voice saying, remind them, they're not linear. There's no right way to do grief.
I'm so happy you said that right up front, David, because people definitely have been incorrectly, and so many therapists are doing it incorrectly, where it's these stages that you go through, and you have to go through them in this order. And so thank you for freeing people up with that.
Yeah, I think, there's a part of the media at times that wants to reduce things to the 5 easy somethings. And
exactly.
It's not reduced that way, but anyone who's been through grief knows there's no 5 easy anything.
No, not at all.
So that's how I got into this world. I've spent decades doing this. I wrote a few books on my own. I also wrote another book with Louise Hay. And after decades of this work, I got a call a few years ago that my younger son, David, had died unexpectedly.
Oh, gosh.
I was thrown into the epicenter of pain.
The top trauma that you can experience.
And I'll tell you, I wanted to write every parent I had ever counseled a letter saying I didn't know how bad the pain was.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And I had to literally do everything I told people to do. I had to go to grief counseling. I had to go to a grief group. Caroline, I showed up in a grief group. I took my contacts out, put my glasses on, put a cap on. I went to a grief group and I sat 5 feet from a table with my books on it.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I couldn't tell anyone in the group, that's me, I'm the expert. I had to be the father that buried a child. And so I did everything. One of the things that was really beneficial to me, and I try to do for others, is for decades, one of my main groups of people that I have taught is therapists. For decades, sat with hundreds of therapists, thousands of therapists, maybe even millions, who knows. But I have to tell you, they would tell me throughout the years of the tragedies they've been through, how they got into this work, why they did it. And they, in my own grief, they were evidence that life is possible after loss. And so even in my own grief, I would remember them and I would go, if they could do it, I can find life again. But the interesting thing about that is I had my mind, my professional mind, that would say, yep, you're in denial, because the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Yep, you're in denial. I couldn't believe he was gone. Yes, you're angry, you're furious. Yes, you're bargaining. I did all the what ifs.
Yeah.
You're sad, you're depressed. And then when I began to get to acceptance, Kubler-Ross and I always told people, because they treated acceptance like the end. And, when people always say to me, how long will grief last? And I hope we talk in a moment about how grief is sometimes not about death. But, when I get asked, how long will someone grieve? I always go, how long is a person going to be dead? As if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. It doesn't mean always with pain. Ultimately, we grieve with love. So I got to tell you, Caroline, when I got to the idea that, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to accept his death someday, I'm like, it's not enough.
No.
I just don't want to accept it. And I don't think we're a generation that just wants to accept it.
No.
That's when I thought, I think I need more. And the more turned out to be meaning.
Mm.
And so that's when I started writing about this idea of finding meaning. And I'm so honored the Kubler-Ross family and foundation allowed me to add a sixth stage to her stages. And of course, I said, not a new mandatory stop on any timeline. So
No,
that's the short version of that. And it's still a long version, but that's sort of what's got me here and my dedication to helping folks.
David, thank you for your vulnerability. And it's inconceivable. There are no words for a parent going through that kind of loss. It's just impossible to process and understand. And thank you for your work. And thank you for adding that sixth stage. Let's talk about that sixth stage.
Well, I think, the confusing thing for people when they hear meaning, they'll go, because they see the book sometimes, they'll go Finding Meaning and they'll
Yeah,
go,
I got
there's
it.
no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in a murder. There's no meaning in a divorce. And I'll tell them, meaning is not in the death or the tragedy. Meaning is in us. It's what we do after.
Mm.
It's
That's
how
so
we show
good.
up. And the other thing I want to say, people hear meaning and they think, oh, am I supposed to start a charity? Am I supposed to get a 5 and 10K run dedicated to them?
Mm.
Meaning is in the moments, Caroline.
Mm.
And sometimes we just got to name them. I got to tell you, right now, doing this conversation with you, knowing we're going to help people, is a moment of meaning.
I agree.
Can I talk a little bit about grief and also being non-death and all that? Because I know that was
Please go ahead. Go ahead. Just run. I've got questions, but I like the flow. You on a flow.
And I know you had
Just
said
keep going. Keep going.
What's grief? So grief, when it comes to a loved one dying, is love. Grief is ultimately love. Grief is also a change we didn't want.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a divorce. Sometimes it's a breakup. Sometimes it's a job loss. And one of the questions I get asked, and this is really important, is what's the worst grief? Now, the easy answer, many people think, oh, it is the death of a child. But I got to tell you, if your spouse died after 50 years and your kids are all alive, death of a child isn't your worst grief. Death of a spouse is your worst.
Yeah.
If your parent died, so when people say, what's the worst grief? My answer is always yours. The grief you're dealing with is the worst grief. It may be the divorce. It may be your parent dying. It may be the sibling. It might be the breakup. So lots of different griefs in our world.
That's such a good answer. There's so many directions we can go in, David. In terms of, how about, one of the things people talk about is why shouldn't you avoid grief? I mean, we know we've got to face it and deal with it, and I know there's a timeline because, and I know from my own work that if you force someone, and there's a lot of therapies out there that say, okay, in the moment you've got to do it, there's this timeline, and if you don't do it, then I'm sure you agree with me, that's like one of the worst things, because you've got to let the person lead it. So when you're ready to talk about it, that's really important. So there's obviously the stages you go through, but when this whole question of avoiding grief, of when should you avoid it, people are different. So maybe talk about avoiding grief, why we shouldn't avoid grief, but talk about it in the context of our unique experiences that each of us have. So there isn't a formula for...
I'll tell you, I have an online grief educator certificate program that I train therapists and coaches and people who have been through their dark nights and turned their pain into purpose. And one of the things I teach them that's so important to know is exactly what you said. You meet the client where they are. You meet them on their timeline, not any other timeline, but their timeline. And if we are expecting someone to be further along than they are, we're not with them. So it's very important what you mentioned. So there isn't a timeline of grief. But I will tell you, there's anticipatory grief that happens before the death.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that can happen before the divorce. It can happen before the addiction. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen with. We anticipate a lot of losses. Then I often think of there's when someone dies or the breakup of the divorce happens, there's the acute phase when we just can't breathe. We're just struggling, taking it day by day. And then we move into what I call early grief. When it's a death, I think of early grief is roughly average different on everyone is 2 years.
What did you say that was called? That was, just repeat what that one was called,
It's early grief for people who have had a death. Because if I went to the local mall and said, when do you think early grief is? People would say, oh, a month, a week, a year.
Yeah.
It's often around 2 years.
Wow.
It has a much longer shadow than we think. And then we'll eventually move into mature grief and hopefully in time, in our own way, remember with more love than pain. Your question, why avoid it? It is our natural state to try to avoid pain. Who wants to be in pain? Part of the problem is we think if we go into the pain, we're going to be stuck there. People say to me, David, if I started crying, I would never stop.
That's such a good example.
I've been with so many people. Everyone eventually stopped crying. Everyone stopped crying. And doesn't mean you don't start again, but we all stop. And here's the reason not to avoid it, even though our tendency is to avoid it. What we face, well, first of all, what we run from pursues us.
Yes, absolutely.
What we face transforms us.
It's so good.
And grief is hugely transformative, hugely changes us. You know, we talk about post-traumatic stress all the time. When we talk about meaning and letting it transform us, we're talking about post-traumatic growth.
So important.
And post-traumatic growth actually happens more than post-traumatic stress.
That's beautiful. Talk more about that.
You know, I think we believe we're going to make our grief smaller. It doesn't. We have to grow around it. And so we have to become bigger. And even in all situations, whether it's a divorce, a tragedy, there is something on the other side. There's not it's going to be like it never happened. There's not everything's going to be fine. But, you know, one of the things, and I said I was going to mention this, I don't want to forget, I have this new workbook coming out.
Yes, we must talk about that for sure.
One of the things I put in it is the hero's journey. I believe, for those of you who aren't familiar, and I hope you'll take a look at the workbook, every movie you love, whether it's a comedy or whether it's Star Wars or any of the movies and all that, there's always the hero's journey. Something horrible happens to us. In the movies, it's often a death. Luke Skywalker's parents were killed. There's a death.
Yeah.
And we go on this journey. We're foes and allies, and we have to go into our dark night, which is grief or loss or tragedy. And we eventually can come out of the other side, of course, with our loved ones still gone or the divorce still happened. We don't get to change reality. But that's the growth. And one of the things I did in the workbook is I really showed the hero's journey. And then I have a place for you to do your hero's journey and to understand that you are the hero in your own life, sometimes just for surviving, Caroline.
Yeah, that is
sometimes
so beautiful.
Surviving that marriage, surviving that divorce, surviving that death. You're the hero, and there's an empowerment when we realize that.
A I cannot agree with you more. I'm actually currently writing another book, and it's actually about the healing journey of the hero. So and then I have an app that people that follow me on this podcast, they know, called the Neurocycle. And we are busy updating the version, and the whole thing is the 63 days habit formation healing journey, and then the multiple cycles, because it doesn't, big stuff is going to take more than one. But the point is that there's a journey, it's up and down. And yeah, if we remember that, but very often at the point of grief, when you in that pain, it's almost impossible to believe that there's a journey that's actually going to move forward. You feel like you're stuck in that point. And then one day you're at another point. So time does pass. And as you keep saying, the grief doesn't change. I often use three glasses, and I don't know if you've ever done that, where you take a little stone and you put it in a shot glass. When it happened, it's stuck. That's how you feel initially. And then you put the stone in a bigger glass, same grief, but there's more space around it. You put in a bigger one, there's more space around it. It's not that the grief is changing. The story never goes away. But as you said, you're growing around it. So the post-traumatic growth concept is so beautiful. So let's talk about, like, I know people ask, and you have this question on your website. You have a great FAQ on your website. People will ask, when does grief end? And you already basically answered that. As long as people, death doesn't ever end. So the grief is going to...
Right. But the pain changes.
The pain changes. That's key.
Here's the thing.
That's
our
key.
Mind, one of the things that happens in trauma, and a lot of griefs are traumatic. I always say all grief doesn't have trauma, but all trauma has grief.
That's very good.
And one of the things the mind tricks us when we're in enormous pain, it whispers to us and say, this pain is forever.
Yes.
And it's not. It's going to change. It's going to change.
That's so important to know that, because there may be someone listening now who's in the midst of some really, whatever level of grief. And you just don't feel when you're in that stage that you're ever going to go, but it will change. And
it will change.
There is a journey that's up and down. So that's really fantastic. I wanted to ask, let's talk a little bit about denial, because a lot of people, that's one of the stages, as we know. And in terms of the stages, actually, let's quickly just backtrack. In terms of the stages, you've said they're not necessarily linear. And that's also been what the research shows. It's also been your experience, my experience. It's up and down. One day you might be in denial, the next day in anger, then you may go back to denial, and then you may go. So it's much more. It's almost like there's those 6 things. You've added the 6th one, and I just love that, the meaning, the hero's journey, the growth. But there could be a little bit of growth back after denial, and whatever. It's unique for each person.
I can go through all the stages in an hour.
There you go.
And I'll tell you one of the things. I do a lot of posting on my social media. I couldn't get my name, so I had to become I am David Kessler. But I wasn't trying to be like I am Spock. But
I love it.
I see people so many times, they'll come on and they'll post and they'll go, you're just trying to, with the stages, neaten everything up. And I'll go, oh my gosh, grief is the messiest, confusing thing you'll ever go through. There's nothing neat about grief.
Nothing predictable either.
Nothing predictable. It is waves. It is a storm. When you think it's over, it just circles back. Sometimes like a hurricane, the winds go one way, all of a sudden they turn the other way.
You're walking straight and suddenly your feet are knocked out from underneath you.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the denial one, because that's
oh yes, denial. So denial gets a bad rap. Oh, they're in denial. First of all, I think of denial as a really protective mechanism.
I agree.
It protects us. It says we're not quite ready for something. And one of the things that people go, oh, my sister, my spouse, they're in denial. And they have this underlying fear that the grief's going to get lost. They need to deal with the grief, but we're going to lose it. No. The grief is safely sitting on a shelf. And the mind is so wise, when it's ready, it comes down. And when it comes down, it's never a good time. It comes down before the wedding or something. It's never a good time. But the mind is wise that it knows when that's going to happen. And it helps pace our grief. You know, I say, if all of your grief hit you in one day, you would be on the floor and you'd never get up.
Exactly. Yet the broken heart syndrome that we hear so much about is very real. It's not something. While we're on this topic, let's quickly talk about each of the stages in any order you want, because
Sure.
people often get confused with anger. That's another question we get a lot is,
let's talk about anger.
why am I angry? Yeah, let's talk about anger and grief.
So first of all, anger, I always say, is pain's bodyguard.
That's so good.
You know, anger is an expression of pain. I believe we have two primal expressions of pain. If someone came in right now and gave me the worst news in the world, I think I've already had it, but if someone gave me the worst news, some people would sit in the corner and cry, and we run over to them and we give them lots of support. Oh my gosh, you're crying. I'm here. Can I give you a tissue? What can you do? I, on the other hand, my go-to is anger. So I'd get up and I'd start yelling. People don't circle me and give me support. They say, you go take yourself out of here and you get yourself together. And when you're more appropriate, you come back. But it's an expression of pain, just like sadness is. And
So
we get confused because so many of us have had have had anger modeled so poorly.
Yes.
I have an online grief group called Tender Hearts that I do 4 times a week. People come on, we meet, there's 26 groups. There's times I've demonstrated anger and people will put in the chat, I'm feeling unsafe. And I go, oh my gosh, those imprints from our childhood, dangerous grief, are so strong. We have to remind our mind, we're on a Zoom, he's hitting a pillow. He isn't going to hit anyone. He's hitting a pillow. But we all, when we hear anger, think about that scariest anger we've seen, and we forget there's a healthy anger. There's a healthy anger that's fueled, that's an expression that we can have. So then we also, it's easy to say then we go, but it's not true. In all the mix-up of things, we may also visit bargaining.
Yeah.
Bargaining before death is the please God, don't let her die. I'm going to volunteer more. I'm going to be a better person. The deal making. After death, it's the what ifs and if onlys. And I have to tell you, that's another thing. I'm so finally did this in this workbook. I have places for people to write down all their what ifs, and we go through them one by one to help them go from what if I would have done this to deeply understanding, even if you did that, they still would have died. So that's the what ifs and if onlys. Then we have the depression, which, by the way, in Kubler-Ross's time, it was sadness. It wasn't clinical depression. So we run from sadness. We don't even use the word sadness. We go, oh my gosh, we got bad news at lunch. We were all so depressed, but we're fine now. Really, you went into a full depression at lunch and now you're fine? So it's the sadness. And that last one we talked about is acceptance. And the one thing I want to say is there's not one big acceptance. There's many, many acceptances. There's many, many acceptances. Okay? Many acceptances.
That's very important. There are many stages of, different levels and times that you're going to start accepting things. Could you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we think I was looking for acceptance everywhere. Finally, I found it. Like it was in that drawer. I didn't look in that drawer. That's not how acceptance works. Have a little bit of acceptance when you have to plan the funeral. Have a little bit of acceptance just to show up for the funeral. You have to have a little acceptance to show up in court for the divorce. But there's going to be lots more acceptances. Lots more acceptances. There's going to be a time you really have to sit with, wow, they're not coming back. Wow, this marriage is really over. Lots and lots of acceptances.
That's
So
so brilliant.
we want to keep all those in mind.
That's beautiful. It's a little tiny things that cumulatively build up.
Right.
Let's talk about your workbook, because there's so much beautiful stuff that you said, and there's so much. Sometimes people aren't in a place where they can go and read your fantastic books and get through a book when they're in a place of grief, and they'll get there. But you've brought this workbook out now that is maybe a good stepping stone into, because really with grief, sometimes the reading does help, but some people are just like they need something very simple and very, well, you still be reading, but
And
something very
here's the
simple.
thing. I have a waiting list. I can't see all the people who would like to see me.
Exactly. I'm just pulling up if I'm looking away from you, it's because I'm pulling up your PDF. It closed down.
And here's the book. I'll show it. It's the blue book. There's a lot of fake workbooks out there. This is it, the Finding Meaning Workbook. And, I'll tell you, I wanted something as if you were going to sit down with me. I wanted to take you through it, take you through all the exercises I would do with you. Because, number one, twofold. Some people can't find anyone to see.
Yeah.
Can't afford someone.
Exactly. I was going to say that.
Some way for them to get help. Also, therapists say to me all the time, give me tools I can use with my clients. I want therapists to be able to go, there's a great exercise in this book. Let's do it together. So I wanted tools for people. And I'll tell you, just like we've talked about acceptance, I have so many tools for them to walk through acceptance, to deal with anger, to learn how we tell our own stories. And, there's all kinds of checklists. And there's like mapping your grief, finding your way back home, resolving guilt. Huge things like that. And how to, I'm just looking, expressing the expressed. So many times in our own grief, our thinking revolves instead of evolves.
That's really good.
The workbook.
Revolves instead of evolves. That's brilliant.
Yeah, and we want to
That's evolve. The doing. Now that's really good. Okay, let's do it.
And one of the things, just so I can tell this, I don't want to forget to do this because I can forget things, is we have a special site where whether you buy it on Amazon or your local bookstore, Barnes & Noble, any of those, if you go to griefbook.com, when you purchase it there, you're going to get me in a class to even help you, a free companion class. So that's at griefbook.com.
That's beautiful. That's amazing. Okay, so David, let's do a little, can you give us, you said that you've got lots of techniques and exercises, and if a therapist has got someone in front of them and they're battling with the anger portion, let's take the anger one. And because we spoke about that earlier, you gave an example, nice example. So let's say someone did come into you're working with them and they did have an anger outburst and it's part of that grief reaction. What technique in your book could they do to start?
The first thing I would do is to talk to them. Even before we got here, I would talk to them about this idea of how common anger is and how normal anger is. And to understand that anger is fuel. And I think we have to really understand all those things and to where that pain comes from. And I might do, there's a million of these things in here. Like, for instance, let me just tell you, one exercise is talking about and working through the life you didn't get. Mm-hmm. How many of us get angry about, no, you don't understand. My parent wasn't supposed to die at 60. My spouse wasn't supposed to die before my retirement. No, we were supposed to be happily ever living after. They weren't supposed to divorce me. So sometimes you have to really process and get angry about a life you didn't get. Because that's what you were hoping for. That's what you were deserving. So things like that are really interesting in the book that I think is going to help a lot of people.
That's fantastic. So what about a guilt thing? Because there's so much around grief. I know with the people I've worked with, that guilt is such a huge thing, that the guilt of could I have done more? It links to the whole denial, the whole if only. What did you say? Before the anticipatory grief, and then
Right.
the grief after, where how it shifts from bargaining to then the fact that you sort of if only, could have, should have, would have, and that's the guilt. If only I had done this at that time, then this would be the situation, which is all a narrative that's not true. And you talk a lot about the narratives we tell ourselves. Could you give an example of that from your workbook and talk around that a little?
So let me just say, first of all, I'm going to give you a nugget from the workbook that when you let this in, it changes everything. Our mind would always rather feel guilty than helpless.
That's very powerful.
Here's the thing. We don't want to live in a world where people die. We don't want to live in a world where people can divorce us or break up with us or betray us out of the blue. We don't want that world. So we've lost control. How does our mind try to find control? You know what? If I would have done this differently, they wouldn't have divorced me. Oh, I have some control. My mind can fool itself that if I do the next marriage differently, the rest of my life differently, I'll be safe from that. And so our mind clings on to this guilt because in a weird way, the guilt makes us feel safe, but it comes with a cost. And so I often, like when people like I work with, we have to wrestle to, because people, and I talk about this, there's a concept called confabulation. We believe our own lies. We believe, if only I hadn't gone to lunch, they'd still be here. If only I had not spent so much time with the kids, we wouldn't have got divorced. If only I had, not cared about work, like all those what ifs and if onlys. And I'll tell you, they can be really cruel. Our mind can be cruel to us. And so I work people through 4 different techniques to really help wrestle that guilt out of them.
That's beautiful. Can you share part of one of them just in the little bit of time that we have left? We only have a few minutes left. So, because that guilt I know is a massive thing.
Right. So one is confabulation. We talk about that. We believe our own stories. The next one is what I call proximal causation. We naturally assume it to be true what happens before the death or the breakup or the tragedy is what caused it. Oh my gosh, if I would have taken their call, they wouldn't have died by suicide. Oh my gosh, if I would have, if gotten them to the meeting, they wouldn't have died by the addiction. If I had told them they really got to get their checkup, they wouldn't have had the heart attack. If only I had, right before the death, we had that argument. I can't tell you how many people think an argument caused the divorce.
Yeah.
What we falsely believe, the thing that happened before caused it. Not true.
So it's fantastically, beautifully explained. What is one thing that they could start to do, and then they get your workbook, obviously, but that they could start to do to deal with that? What do they do? What does a person do when they?
One thing we could do, the biggest thing we could do for all of us, in grief, out of grief, to sit with and just question, what if all the stories I tell myself in my mind, what if they're not all true? I almost say, allow yourself to introduce a little doubt. What if that story that I'm beating myself up about today isn't quite reality? That's the biggest thing we can do.
So what if you think, well, that phone call or that argument caused the suicide or whatever, it's to say to yourself, what if that's
Here's
not
the
true?
question to say to yourself. Is it true? Is it for sure true? Is it true that they're not here because of the kids? Is it true that if I wouldn't have worked so much, is it true that it was one missed doctor's appointment? Just allow yourself to question it a little, and you'll see that begins to make a dent that the light can come into the darkness.
That's amazing. Wow. David, this is incredible. So helpful. Where can people get hold of your book? I mean, I've got the PDF open here, and it's great.
The workbook is the blue one called Finding Meaning, and it's the grief workbook, tools for remembering pain, for releasing pain and remembering with love. And if they just go to either grief.com, my website, or if they go to griefbook.com, there's all the places they can buy it at: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. Find it anywhere, wherever fine books are sold, as they say. And I have a free course that goes with it. So check out the Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief workbook.
Fantastic. And then if they want to go deeper, they can actually get the book as well. So the book is
the book. When they get the book, they get the companion class with it.
Fantastic. So the workbook is there, but there's also a book, Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. Is that the one that goes with the workbook?
It is, but I don't want to say to people in grief, get 2 books.
So just get the one. Just get the workbook.
Start with the workbook.
Start with the workbook.
You can work backwards when you want a little more.
That sounds fantastic. And then you're also very active on social media. You have lots on YouTube. And your social media handle, again, just give that to people.
I am David Kessler. I am David Kessler. I'm now even on TikTok, so you can find me all over.
Good job. I am too. But boy, TikTok's a different story, isn't it?
It's a different story, boy. I'll tell you. It's a different story. But
David,
I'm there.
You're there and you're on social media. This has been fantastic, David. Thank you so much for your wisdom. I know so many people have been helped. I've been helped, and I encourage people to get that workbook. And I look forward to our next conversation. All my viewers and listeners, David will definitely be back either on this podcast or in my NeuroLive seminars that I have on in the Neurocycle app. Watch this space and go get David's book. And David, thank you for your wisdom.
Oh, Caroline, thank you for all you do in helping me spread the word today and helping people know about the grief workbook. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.